Good morning and welcome to What's Up with Power. We are happy to be here this morning. We've got a great group joining us on Zwift for a group ride this morning. We've got Nate Dunn from Data Driven Athlete ready to give us some insights, some knowledge. Today we're going to be learning all about the performance manager chart. So some of you may be familiar with this chart in Training Peaks. We're going to talk about it in depth. How do you understand it? What does it mean from the high level perspective? Nate's always got his great insights, and we're happy to have him back. In fact, I'm going to bring him on the screen. How you doing, Nate?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, very happy to have you. And recently, you've launched your own live video series on your own page. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've been inspired by the work of Team ODZ and this broadcast. So yeah, we're gonna have another one next week, early in the morning, same a little bit earlier than what you've got going on here. And so yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So yeah, would love to have anybody tune in and watch what we've got going on too at our website and on our Facebook page. So
it's DDA Live is what you call it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right on the Data Driven Athlete Facebook page. So if you give them a like and a follow, you should get notified when they go live. Yeah, good stuff. In fact, I think the first episode you talked about the taper, right?
Yeah, I talked about the taper, and so there's some crossover with what we're going to be talking about today as well. And next week, actually, we'll be talking about training in hot conditions. So that'll be our topic for next week. So
very cool. Okay, well, we've got about 30 seconds here before our group ride starts. So we'll wait for that to get started, and then I'll just slide off the screen and let you do your thing. So, in fact, you know what? Let's do that now. I'm sure anyone who's in game is ready. So with that, I'll let you go and just let me know when to advance the slides.
Awesome. Yeah. So today we'll be talking about the performance manager chart or performance management chart. Also, we refer to it as the PMC. So just to kind of get clear on some of that jargon there. And we're going to jump in and really try and talk about how to use it in an applied sense. Not so much about the mechanics of it, but more in an applied sense. So thanks again for having me on, and looking forward to talking about it. So next slide, please. So we used this slide before when I came on to talk a little bit about file review, but it's important again to talk about because it kind of gives us this hierarchy of understanding our data. So it starts with kind of on the bike and setting up your screens on your Garmin or other device, and then the file review process, which we talked about and which you could review in a previous episode. weekly and monthly trends, and I think that's something that you guys covered maybe a couple weeks ago. And then today about the performance manager chart. So it's important to kind of understand each of these steps, and the performance management chart is kind of your large, I'd say, cloud-based perspective on all of your data, and a really cool way to add context to all those other layers of data. So next slide, please. So before we talk about some of the specifics of the performance manager chart, it's important to know that accurate data is a must. So sometimes single leg power meters can kind of mess up some of the calculations of the performance manager chart, because performance manager chart is built off this metric of TSS. And TSS is based first on accurate data coming from your power meter, and then also based on an FTP setting that you have set in Training Peaks. So it's important to kind of take care of both of those elements, and to make sure that your power meter is accurate, it's calibrated, and also your FTP setting is up to date in Training Peaks, to make sure you're getting the best use out of that. So in addition to that, if you're looking to use the performance manager chart to also look at different trends in your data, you really want to make sure that no matter what point in the season it is, you're frequently doing best efforts. So those don't have to be a specific duration. They could be best efforts in a group ride or in a Zwift race or whatever. But it's important that no matter what time of season is, I think it's useful to get best efforts throughout the year. And we'll talk about that a little bit further in the presentation as to why that's really important. So next slide, please. So we're going to skip over kind of the formula that's used to, that drives the performance manager chart. We want to talk about it more in an applied sense. If you have specific questions about kind of the mechanics of the performance manager chart, you can Google performance manager chart. It's also, talked about extensively in chapter 8 of Training and Racing with the Power Meter. But we're going to kind of gloss over some of that stuff and jump right into in an applied sense. So next slide, please. So even kind of jumping over some of that, we want to talk about the very basics, and that is that the performance management chart is built off of TSS, or training stress score. So in a very simple sense, TSS is a relative measure of training stress of your ride. So if your power at LT, or if your power at FTP is 300 watts, and if you were to ride for 1 hour at 300 watts, then that would be equal to 100 TSS points. So it's important to understand that at a very basic level, that is kind of the foundation of the entire performance manager chart. So next slide, please. So kind of using that as a foundation, the different components, the units used in the performance manager chart are expressed in TSS per day. So each of these different metrics that we're going to talk about briefly are expressed in TSS per day. And the first one, ATL, or acute training load, and that's simply a representation, an approximate representation of your fatigue over about a week. And then we have CTL, or chronic training load, which is your fitness over a few months. And then we have TSB, or training stress balance, which is CTL minus ATL, which is an approximation of your fitness. So again, if you want to look into these in more depth, you can check it out online, but really quick kind of introduction here. So on the next slide, we have what the performance management chart actually looks like in a graphical sense. So you can see ATL represented in that pink line, CTL blue, and then TSB orange or yellow. So it's a pretty intuitive chart, right? As we ride a lot, our fatigue goes up, our freshness goes down, and so you see ATL and TSB kind of being a mirror image of each other, and then we have CTL in the middle, being a representation of your fitness. So it makes a lot of sense when we look at it in terms of kind of what happens when we ride more to our fitness and to our fatigue. But a really cool system for looking at our fitness over a full season. So next slide, please. So who cares, right? It's a beautiful looking chart. It makes sense. It's fun to play with, but in a practical sense, what difference does it make to our training? And the first thing is that it really allows us the ability to analyze historical trends and to give context to our best efforts. And that's, I think, probably one of the best values, is to look back over previous training and to look and see where did our best efforts occur, and what was the different combination of CTL, ATL, TSB, what contributed to that best effort. So it allows us to look at those historical trends. It also helps to provide motivation for individual efforts. So I know for myself personally, and for a lot of athletes that I've worked with, it's very motivating to look at that chart and to know that no matter where you're at in terms of your fitness, you can say, hey, if I keep plodding along, if I keep completing these workouts, this is where I can be, and I know what it feels like to be there at that number, right? So we'll have another picture to kind of represent that, but it really provides motivation and puts in context the value of every single workout that you do, and the concept of consistency and remaining consistent over the course of a whole season. So it kind of gives us that good picture. And then also it helps us to model future fatigue and fitness. So we can build out future TSS values and assign those TSS values to workouts. And then we can visualize kind of this concept of the taper and the peak for a peak event. We'll be looking at that in a little bit more depth. So next slide, please. So it might be a little bit difficult to look at on your screen, but this is a picture of a performance management chart, a custom performance management chart in WKO4. And layered inside this PMC are 20-minute best efforts. So this is an example really of where looking at historical trends can be really interesting and can be really informative. And we can see here in this performance management chart, over the course of 6 years, most of our best 20-minute power outputs are kind of clustered in this one corner. And so this helps us to be able to look at it in context and to say, what was different about this season? What changed? Did we ride with more intensity? Did we ride with more volume? What happened here? So it helps us to kind of cue in on some of the context for where our historical best efforts were. And then next slide, please. And so this is an example kind of what we talked about in terms of providing motivation, where sometimes when you are suffering from an injury or an illness or whatnot, it can be really demotivating, or it can be really sobering to look at your performance management chart and to see where that chart where it's at. But on the other side, it can also provide a lot of motivation to say, I need to get back at it. I need to chip away. I need to chip away, workout after workout after workout. And I know that I can get back to a competitive level of fitness. And I know, at least for me personally, it's played a huge role in some big challenges that I've had on the bike, in health, different types of health things, to be able to look at that and to say, it's not about trying to, be at my best right now. It's about, chipping away over time and completing quality workouts and kind of putting together that consistency week after week. So next slide, please. So finally, when we talk about peaking with the performance management chart, how do you do that? And that's kind of what training and racing, that's kind of what this chapter 8 talks about. And so we're going to talk really briefly, about that process of peaking and tapering with the performance management chart to kind of give you an idea of how to do that. So the first thing you want to do is you want to analyze your data and see what it's telling you. So just like we did in one of those first slides, is that where have you been at your best in the past? So maybe, the race that you're most excited about is a criterium. And so maybe you would be looking at 40-minute normalized power, and that's kind of, the target that you're looking for. So where have your 40-minute, peak normalized power, where have those occurred in the past? What was the different combination of riding and fitness and fatigue that contributed to that best effort? So the first thing you want to do when you're kind of planning out that taper is to look at all that and see if it's telling you a story. And if you feel like you're getting some good information from that, and if you have an accurate power meter, and if your FTP settings have been current in that performance management chart, then maybe you can look at some of those CTL and TSB targets, and you can say, hey, this looks like a really good place for me to be. Now, in the book Training and Racing with a Power Meter, it has some charts that give some basic recommendations for different types of events and different TSB targets that you might want to target for those. So that can also be a great asset to look at. If you're not really sure about where your bests, kind of what context your best happened in, then that can be another good resource to check that out. But so using that, you can then model what your peak would look like. So you can look into the future and say, this is where my date is. This is when I want to be at my best. And this is how I'm going to plan out my training, modeling, using TSS to be at my best. So we actually break this down a lot more in depth in our first episode of Data Driven Athlete Live, of DDA Live. So you can check that out on our website, where we talk about the specific mechanics of the taper and why we make different choices in that. And we talk about that much more in depth in that episode. But right now we're kind of taking just a cursory look at how to look at that on the performance management chart. So next slide, please. So this kind of gives us a visual representation of what this process of building the taper looks like. So in the performance management chart on Training Peaks, whenever you're planning into the future, you see these different lines of TSB, ATL, and CTL, you see those in a dotted line, right? So that kind of gives us that perspective of what it looks like in the future. So this is an example of where we picked a specific date. This was March 26th. We picked a specific date, and we were targeting a TSB of between +1 and +5, and how we could build out future workouts to look and see how we could achieve that combination of fitness and fatigue on a specific day, and then kind of what that looks like using the performance management chart. So I know we've talked about these things kind of in a really quick way, but this kind of gives you a picture of what's possible in using the performance management chart in terms of knowing knowing in what context your best efforts have happened in the past, and then using that as really a firm foundation to be confident in planning a race or in planning what your preparation looks like as you head into your race strategy. Next slide, please. So a few limitations about the performance management chart. First of all, it's only a model, right? It's a useful tool, but that tool depends on the quality of the data that you feed it. So in addition to that, it could be that you feed your performance management chart great data, and maybe it just didn't work. Maybe the tool wasn't useful in the context that you were using it. So it's important to know that it's not magic. You can't just plan out a bunch of workouts and then know with precision exactly how you're going to be at your best. Obviously, the more data you have, the more years you have, the more experience you have, it's going to be a more useful tool, but it's not magic. So in addition to that, we had talked about the importance of best efforts. But remember that for a lot of people, if you're not testing on a regular basis, your best efforts might only be coming when you're most motivated, right? So it's important to not draw, too strong of conclusions from the performance management chart. If you're only ever executing best efforts, let's say, for a couple races in June and July, then it wouldn't be appropriate to draw conclusions about your best combination of CTL and TSB based off those best efforts, because those are the only times you're going hard throughout the whole year anyways. So it's important, I think, when you're looking at your best efforts in the context of the performance management chart, to make sure that you're either testing specific durations throughout the whole season, or if you're not testing those specific durations, to then create custom durations that you're tracking that are constrained to what your best efforts are. So if you're doing a regular group ride, maybe your best effort regularly on that group ride is between 10 and 12 minutes, right? So it might be that for you, 20 minutes really isn't a very good duration to track because you're rarely going as hard as you can over 20 minutes. So maybe instead, you have a specific climb that's maybe 7 minutes, and then that's what you're tracking because you're doing that throughout the course of the year. So in addition to that, if you don't have any of those and it's just regular, either group rides or races, then maybe normalized power is a better metric to track in context with your performance management chart. So like we talked about before, maybe that's 40-minute normalized power. Maybe you're regularly doing a group ride throughout the whole year. And so that's one thing you can look at to see where your best efforts occurred to get the best use out of that performance management chart. And then what we talked about before too is don't overinterpret. It's just a tool, and it's a tool that's based on a lot of your ride data and based on a lot of other variables there, but it's just a tool. It's not perfect. It's not perfectly precise, and it's important to kind of take that into consideration. So next slide, please. So when we put all these ones together, I think again it's important to kind of build off that progression of your knowledge about understanding data with the quality of the data that that you're recording on your head unit, kind of how you display that when you're doing interval workouts, to understanding how to pick apart a file and kind of get the best information from each of your file reviews, to maybe how to look and how to analyze monthly and weekly trends in your data, and then kind of all the way up to what we talked about, where that performance management chart provides kind of the largest global context for all of that other data. So we're going to jump straight into our question and answer session. If you have any questions about the performance management chart or really any other topics that we've discussed, would love to answer anything that you've got.
Very good. Okay, I'm coming on the screen. Let your questions fly in Facebook. We will relay them as they come. I think one of the questions that comes up a lot we hear on the performance manager chart is kind of like, what's the ideal TSB I should shoot for, right? We talk about the taper, and I'm sure you hit on this a little bit. in your DDA live, but maybe you even already hinted at this in that you probably want to take the context of past performances, but I'll let you maybe address that more specifically. You know, somebody's asking, what should I aim my TSB to be on a on a race day, like numbers wise?
Yeah.
What, yeah.
That's a good question. So yeah, so I would say the first thing is to use past performance. You know, that's, you hear people talk about that. You know, the best predictor of your performance, of future performance, is your performance. So if you have a lot of good data to look at, then I think that can be a great place to start. So if you're not confident in the data that you have, or if you don't really have that, I think what this chapter talks about, which makes a lot of sense, is that the best answer to that question would be it depends. If you're talking about a shorter criterium, so if you're talking about an event that maybe is under an hour, that has a lot of explosive efforts, then maybe a more positive TSB is more advantageous because you're more rested, and the decrease in fitness, or CTL, that you would incur in acquiring that more positive TSB would be, you know, less of a detriment to your performance in a shorter event. So what that translates to in a real number might be something like, you know, plus 10 to plus 20, right? Or maybe plus 10 to plus 25 TSB for a shorter, more explosive event. That might be a good kind of target range for something like that. Now, if you're talking about a longer road race, or if you're talking about, you know, a multi-day stage race or something like that, then maybe a little bit lower TSB, somewhere around, you know, plus 5. Maybe that makes more sense because you're sacrificing a little bit of that freshness for a little bit better fitness. So it really, you know, I think that's those are the best guidelines that you can utilize going into a target event, to say conceptually this makes sense. In terms of, if it's at a longer event, then maybe we would prefer a little bit more fitness. But if it's a really, really long event, you know, like the Tour de France, you oftentimes hear people talk about how, you know, you don't want to go in really sharp into the first day of a multi-week, you know, tour, because you're going to be accumulating so much fatigue over those 3 weeks. So I would say it really depends on your event. If you're looking for a long tour, if you're going on like a week-long tour overseas or something like that, then I would prioritize a greater amount of freshness going into that. If it's a road race or something like that, then maybe you're kind of in between, where you're trying to find that balance between fitness and freshness. And if it's a short criterion, then I think, you know, erring on the side of more TSB or more freshness probably makes the most sense.
So, Nate, question along those lines.
Yeah.
Say you're heading into like a 6-week, you know, once a week series, like a cross season or a weekly crit or something like that. Would you say, in reference to that it would be good to peak your training beforehand and then kind of just finesse it as you go through the 6 weeks?
I would say it depends on what your goals for that series are. So if your goals are to like win a series outright, you know, and let's say the series is based on accumulated points and you really need to be good on every single one of those races, then I think it would make a lot more sense to basically taper for that first race, or to peak for that first race like you would a priority race, to start off the series on a high note, you know, to get your first win or whatever. Now, if your goal is to win a specific race in that series, maybe it's like, you know, the capstone race of that series towards the end, then I think I would probably train through those races and continue to build fitness, you know, as you progress through the series. But I think that's where the performance management chart can be really helpful, is that it gives you that perspective on, if you're racing every single week, it can be really difficult or impossible to make any meaningful improvements in your fitness. Because if you're backing off each time before you come into a race, you know, and I see this with athletes a lot. It's like they've got a Tuesday night race series or a Thursday night race series, and they say, well, I can kind of train through that, but I still want to be really good, and I don't want to show up and not be at my best. And that's okay, but then it comes with the acknowledgement that your fitness probably isn't going to get better over those 6 weeks. You're probably just going to, you know, unless you can pile up some extra training on the weekend to kind of, you know, supplement that. But so I think you just kind of have to understand those trade-offs and about what your specific goals are over the course of that series to plan out the best approach.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, great questions. I think this is definitely a lot where a lot of the questions lie. Is it seems pretty, at least for me, it's pretty straightforward. How do you plan for a one-day thing, right? But then,
Yeah.
just like as Dave brings in, multi-week efforts where, you can't, how are you going to peak for 6 weeks straight, right? So how do you maintain during that, and how do you keep things up? And, being
Well,
on form every week can be difficult.
yeah, well, and I would say this is where I wouldn't underestimate the power of kind of psychology, where this is where I think that it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And you could say the same thing about kind of beginning a race series or beginning a race season. So let's say you're going to start racing in February or whatever. And from a sports psychology perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense to enter into that, whether or not it's your race season or whether or not it's, a cyclocross series over 6 weeks or whatever, to enter into that in a really big hole. It makes a lot more sense to me to start out and being in really good shape. Maybe not, maybe not your best shape, but to be in really, really good shape, because winning is incredibly motivating, right? And when you start out and you come out on that first race and you're on fire, um, that's really motivating, to your training over the course of those next 6 weeks. Now, if you've done that before and you have that historical context and hey, when I start out and I'm really good on the first week, I just don't have what it takes to sustain that motivation throughout the 6 weeks, then I would defer to that experience and that historical context to say, well, then make some plans, maybe midway through the series or whatever, and try and hang on in the beginning to accumulate enough points. So I think, but I would err probably on the side of being sharper to start a series like that, if it's based on accumulated points, because winning is easy, right? Finding motivation when you're winning is easy. You want to come back, you want to race because you're crushing everybody, and I think it makes more sense to try and plan for that than to start a series being less than your best.
Great advice. So here's a question. Let's say somebody's got every week they've kind of got two events, like a midweek training series, and typically, more important races on the weekends. Maybe not every weekend, but midweek training race, weekend big race. Obviously, weekend race is probably your higher priority, bigger, like A races as opposed to maybe a B or C during the week. What advice or how would you kind of structure that weekly training to have that athlete, do both of those?
Yeah. So I think the main challenge when you're essentially racing twice a week like that with a really difficult group ride is that, let's say if you have a really challenging group ride on Tuesday or a relatively challenging group ride on Tuesday, you're probably not going to be good to really do another quality workout till maybe Thursday at best. And so you really kind of crunch your week up, and you make it hard to get, I'd say, to get more quality workout sessions in. And so what I usually try and do is say, well, let's find a compromise. If you're really wanting to do that Tuesday race series, is it possible to go maybe every other week? Can we do, the race series 1 week, and then the next week, can we work on kind of a foundational maybe threshold workout or VO2 max workout, or whatever it is that we're looking at? Can we work on one of those to ensure that you're able to attack that workout with a lot of quality? Because if you're doing a really hard workout on Tuesday, it can be physically and mentally hard to then do another quality workout on Thursday and then to race again on the weekend. So I think finding a compromise between, if you're really wanting to race, finding a compromise between maybe switching off every other week. And if that's not an option, and if you just really enjoy that Tuesday race series, then I think it's important in that context to maybe say, okay, so right now we're going to make some sacrifices maybe to our fitness, and we're going to just enjoy the process of racing. And let's just own that sacrifice and understand that may come with kind of a stagnation or plateau of our fitness. And that's okay, because we're planning for this. But the worst thing I think you can do is to try and race 2 times, and then at the same time to maybe still try and do really hard workouts, and then feel discouraged because you're not able to hit those workouts, and then overall kind of have a demotivating effect on your training. So I'd say to lay it all out there and to say, here's what our compromises are when we race, when we're doing a race series during the week and we're doing one on the weekend. And either I'm okay with that, and that's a lot of fun, and this is a certain phase of the training, or to say, let's make some adjustments to make sure that we're having a more, well-rounded or balanced approach. So we're continuing to progress towards our goals.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. Appreciate that. Question coming in from Facebook from Martin Coster. It says TSS is very dependent on the lactate threshold heart rate, given that intensity factor determines TSS for any given effort. I had a very conservative lactate threshold heart rate of 152 up to now, based on 220 minus the age formula, which just got updated automatically by Training Peaks, 158 after riding in a fast event. I am 46 and am cycling since about 14 months ago, about 8,000 kilometers a year. What lactate threshold heart rates do you see in my age group, and what is conservative versus high?
Sure. So I would say, first of all, that the entire TSS system and the entire performance management chart is built off using power as the foundation of your training. So what Training Peaks did is that they kind of began to adapt that so you could use, so if you didn't have a power meter, or if your power meter wasn't working, that you could still get some type of data into that performance management chart using heart rate or using threshold heart rate. But I would say in general, if you're not using power, the performance management chart is of much less value to you, simply because it wasn't designed to use heart rate data like that. So to answer your question about lactate threshold heart rates, that really depends. So I think a typical lactate threshold heart rate for a masters athlete could be anywhere from 145, 140 to I've had masters athletes that can sustain high 170s. So it's hard to kind of give you a normal average on that, because that normal doesn't really exist. But I would, kind of going back to your original question, I would say if you are really interested in utilizing the performance management chart and utilizing TSS, or training stress score, as kind of a valuable metric in your training, then I would really recommend that you purchase a power meter, because that's what those metrics were designed to use as kind of the fuel of the system. So get a power meter. If not, then you can continue to use those, but recognize that they may not provide as much value to you.
Good answer. And I think he clarified there, and I think he said that he has a power meter only on Zwift, and so I think he's looking to mate that in the real world. And you're right, he doesn't have a power meter to take outside yet. So yeah.
So if you're looking to determine your lactate threshold heart rate out on the road, you're still going to have some problems. I would say your best effort, your best bet is to probably look and see what your lactate threshold heart rate, how it corresponds to your lactate threshold when you're riding on Zwift. You're still going to run into some problems, because your lactate threshold heart rate indoors is likely to be, significantly higher than it is outside. So there's still some variables to kind of get around. But, I would be comfortable using the Training Peaks, estimation, whatever they estimate whatever they estimate your lactate threshold heart rate is. And then recognize that there's a lot of different variables that are going to impact that. How hot is it? How hydrated are you? Have you had caffeine? Are you stressed? So if you're using heart rate as a primary metric, I would say just allow yourself a lot of wiggle room to say, yeah, maybe, plus or minus a bunch. So that's kind of how I would view heart rate.
Good point. One note I want to make there is if you do decide to acquire a power meter for outdoor to mate up what you do on Zwift, I would highly recommend using the same power meter in both scenarios, both outdoors and indoors. There's enough other variables in the mix that can throw things off. So like if, let's say you're using your power meter outdoors, but you're using the power sensor on your smart trainer indoors, there can be differences in where they're measuring and things that can mess up your numbers. So having the same power meter in both scenarios is ideal.
And just to get back to that question, it's a really good question, because it highlights kind of the value of quality data in using the performance management chart. And that is that if you're using heart rate, or if your power meter you're not sure about the accuracy of that power meter, then I would look at the performance management chart as in kind of maybe some passing curiosity. And then the better your data is, or the more consistent your data is, I think you can look at it with more interest as it becomes more valuable and probably gives you some greater insights.
Very good. Well, that wraps up our time for the day. I want to thank you, Nate, again for coming on the show. If you guys haven't checked out his website or sessions coming out, to watch for those. And if you like our channel, we bring you lots of content daily. Give us a like, give us a follow. Really appreciate it. And we'll be back here again with this show, same time, same place next week, 6:30 a.m. Pacific. And I would rattle off other time zones, but I don't remember them off my head right now. But anyway, so thanks for having us, and we'll see you next time.